An unyielding silence has fallen over the American Farm Belt. It is not the silence of a calm Sunday morning or a quiet, fruitful harvest. It is the deafening silence of an economy on the brink of collapse, of a supply chain ruptured, and of a promise broken. From the Central Valley of California to the wind-swept plains of Iowa, an invisible man-made crisis is unfolding. It is a slow-motion catastrophe, and it threatens to bring an entire way of life to its knees. For 3 generations, the Anderson family has worked the same land in rural Iowa, passing down a legacy built on the rhythm of the seasons. Planting corn in the spring, harvesting soybeans in the fall, enduring the brutal cold of the winter. Their lives and their entire community were anchored by the steady, predictable flow of their product to a single ravenous market. China. For years, China was not just a buyer. It was the buyer consuming more than 60% of the world's soybeans. The Andersons, like thousands of other farm families, bet their future on that relationship. They invested in new equipment, expanded their silos, and took out loans to meet the ever-growing demand. Then came April 2025. With a single sweeping declaration, the Trump administration unleashed a new wave of protectionist tariffs, hitting Chinese imports with duties as high as 145%. Washington called it a strike against unfair trade. Beijing called it an attack, and their response was not just immediate, but surgically precise. They didn't just walk away from American products. They slammed the doors shut, and then built a new one elsewhere. In a matter of weeks, US agricultural exports to China were slashed in half, and the steady river of goods that once flowed across the Pacific dried up into a trickle. Suddenly, the Andersons' silos were no longer a symbol of prosperity, but a monument to a harvest with no home. The soybeans they had worked so hard to grow, the lifeblood of their farm, were now an immovable surplus. Prices collapsed, and the once firm ground of their financial security turned to quicksand. A single desperate conversation at a local cooperative in California's Central Valley tells the same story. A representative for a Chinese importer, with a unilateral stroke of a pen, canceled a contract for 1 million tons of almonds. The almond producer, a family who had just finished loading the last of the crop into containers at the port of Oakland, stood watching in disbelief as their entire year's work became a liability, not an asset. These are not just dry numbers in a report. They are real families. Losing contracts, losing paychecks, and losing the future they've been building for years. The ripple effect is more like a tidal wave. For every farm facing ruin, a dozen other businesses in their community are taking on water. The local feed supplier, the tractor repair shop, the regional seed distributor. All of them are seeing a sharp decline in business. The small-town bank, which has been financing these farms for decades, is now looking at a growing portfolio of bad loans, its credit lines tightening by the day. This isn't just about agriculture anymore. It is the systemic collapse of entire rural economies that were built around the old way of doing business. The truck drivers who once moved mountains of grain to the ports are now idle. The workers in the processing plants are facing reduced hours or outright layoffs. The dominoes are falling, and they are falling fast. Adding to the despair is the bitter irony of the situation. The farmers did everything right. They adopted the latest technology. They optimized their fields. They prepared their products to meet the highest global standards. They worked from sunup to sundown to ensure a bountiful harvest, only to have it spoil in silos because a political decision thousands of miles away left them with no market. And the problem is, there's no one to replace a buyer of China's scale. Europe is not an option. Is not an option. Has its own surpluses. Southeast Asia can absorb some of the products, but in volumes that are a fraction of what is needed. The unspoken truth is that for billions of dollars in American agricultural goods, there is no replacement market, no alternative buyer. The crops are simply going to rot. Milk is being dumped. The silos are overflowing, and the debt is mounting. But the story of China's response is even more complex and strategic than a simple act of retaliation. It's a calculated long-term geopolitical play. When Washington imposed its tariffs, Beijing didn't just react. It used the moment to accelerate a broader, pre-existing strategy, decoupling its supply chains from the United States and consolidating its influence in a different hemisphere. As soon as American exports were off the table, China moved with lightning speed, forging new deep relationships with South American nations. Brazil and Argentina, already agricultural powerhouses, became the new pillars of China's food security. Within months, Brazil's share of China's soybean imports soared to an astounding 90%. This was no temporary arrangement. It was the construction of an entirely new logistics system. China poured billions of dollars into its new partners, financing the expansion of Brazilian railways, modernizing ports like Santos and Paranagua, and building new storage facilities. For Beijing, every container of soybeans leaving a South American port is a victory, a tangible symbol of its ability to reshape global trade flows and operate independently of American supply. It is proof that the United States is no longer indispensable. This new dynamic fits perfectly into the broader political framework of the BRICS alliance. Led by China, the bloc is actively seeking to create a multipolar world that challenges what it sees as U.S. hegemony. Brazil, a founding member, is pushing for the expansion of the bloc, while nations like Venezuela and Bolivia openly support the vision of a world led by rising economies in the global south. China's investments in Latin America go far beyond soybeans and corn. Chinese companies now control some of the world's largest copper mines in Peru and Chile, critical to their domestic renewable energy and electronics industries. They are building highways, power grids, and 5G networks across the continent. With each passing year, Washington is not just losing contracts, it is losing strategic ground in a region it once considered its own backyard. The BRICS alliance is the institutional framework for these shifts, giving South America a platform to challenge Western dominance and build a future based on new partnerships. And as American farmers are caught between a man-made crisis at home and a strategic geopolitical shift abroad, they are being hit by a third, compounding blow. While trade routes are closing and markets are vanishing, another vital lifeline has been severed: the labor supply. American agriculture has always relied on migrant workers, particularly from Mexico and Central America, to perform the hardest, most labor-intensive jobs, the work that keeps the system running. But the Trump administration's tougher immigration policies, stricter border controls, and reduced visa programs have cut off this essential workforce at the worst possible moment. Farmers, already burdened by debt and collapsing markets, now find themselves with fields full of ripe crops and no one to harvest them. The paradox is cruel and absolute. Abroad, there are no buyers. At home, there are no hands. This is a crisis of political pride, of rhetoric over reality. The checks from Washington, meant to be a lifeline, are nothing more than a bandage on a wound that keeps getting deeper. They barely cover the mounting expenses and do nothing to fix the structural issues that have been laid bare. For farmers staring at mounting debts, the administration's talk of patriotic farming and sacrifice for a future victory rings hollow. The markets they lost today will not return, and the trust that was broken will not be easily mended. The wave of bankruptcies that is now beginning will not spare anyone. It will hit family farms first and push entire rural communities closer to collapse. If nothing changes, the fall of America's Farm Belt will go down in history, not as an unavoidable tragedy, but as a man-made catastrophe. It will stand as a monument to a trade war that did more damage at home than abroad, and as a stark reminder that in the interconnected global economy, no one, not even the most powerful nation in the world, can afford to unilaterally rewrite the rules without suffering the consequences. The story is still being written, but for now, the silence on the land is all the answer we need. And to stay updated on how this unfolds, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We will see you in the